The office environment is the place where, with the exception of our bedrooms, we spend the greater part of our lives. In any enclosed space where a lot of people spend a lot of time together, there's an increased risk that we will become infected with a cold or flu virus. In winter, the risk is highest, most of all in offices where relative humidity is low. The result? High levels of illness and productivity losses in the billions. In open space offices, the risk of infection is especially high. If a sick colleague breathes, speaks, coughs, or sneezes, thousands of infectious droplets spread through the air in a great many shapes and sizes. In room air, these droplets come together to form an aerosol, that is, a mixture of solid and liquid airborne particles, gases, and water vapor. Depending on their size and weight, these droplets can persist for hours in room air and spread throughout the building via the air conditioning system and human activities. Aerosols expelled by infected individuals are loaded with viruses or bacteria embedded in watery mucus, saliva, and dissolved salts. On leaving our airways, the aerosol droplets, with a moisture saturation of almost 100%, are exposed to much drier room air. Here, the droplets shrink almost instantly to around half of their original size. Having lost almost 90% of their weight due to water loss, their salt concentrations are now hugely increased. If the relative air humidity in the office is within the optimum range for human well-being, namely 40 to 60%, the salt concentration rises to a level where most of the viruses cannot survive and become deactivated. The risk of infection within this optimum range for relative humidity is minimal. However, things look very different if the relative humidity drops to below 40%. This level of humidity causes the dissolved salt to spontaneously crystallize out, since the aerosols are forced to release even more water to the dry air. Once crystallized out, the salts are no longer harmful to viruses. On the contrary, they help them stay active and infectious for longer. The water-rich, wet aerosol now turns into a dry aerosol, containing a higher number of active viruses than the wet aerosol. Therefore, the risk of infection from cold and flu viruses is much higher in dry office air. If these dry aerosols are then breathed in, the abundance of moisture in the respiratory tract redissolves the crystalline salts by water absorption. The still infectious viruses are released onto the mucous membranes of the airways, where they can penetrate into the cells and cause infection. Humans are not entirely defenseless in the face of attacks from viruses and bacteria in their environment. The mucous membranes in our airways protect us from infection by their self-cleaning mechanisms and their immune response. For the effectiveness of our airway immune systems, however, sufficient indoor air humidity is crucially important. The mucous membranes in the nose and the lower respiratory system feature innumerable tiny hairs, cilia, on their surfaces, which move like little whips in a watery saline layer. Cilia are covered with a sticky, gel-like mucus layer that traps pathogens and airborne pollutants. The movement of the cilia transports the mucus to the larynx, where, together with its cargo of pathogens, it can be swallowed or coughed up, and thus rendered harmless. As relative humidity drops, however, the saline and gel layers start to dry out. Volume and thickness of the layers shrink, and the cilia are progressively pressed down until ultimately they can no longer move at all. As a result, the pathogen clearing process comes to a stop. Accordingly, viruses now find it easier to penetrate cells and cause infection. Experiments have shown that the fastest transportation of pathogens, and thus the lowest risk of infection, is achieved at levels above 45% relative humidity. As humidity drops below this value, the cilia find it increasingly harder to move, and the risk of infection increases. Depending on their size and weight, aerosols carrying a cargo of viruses and bacteria can float for hours in room air and spread throughout the building via the air conditioning system. The risk of infection rises proportionally to the time spent in this environment and is directly influenced by the level of room air humidity. Above 45% relative ambient humidity, infectious aerosols from our airways still contain a lot of water and are thus heavy and sticky. The time they float in the air is therefore much shorter as they become deposited on floors and surfaces. In addition, the bonding forces between their water content and the surfaces cause wet aerosols to adhere more strongly to these surfaces, thus making it harder for them to be swept back into the air. If air humidity is sufficiently high, there is therefore a lower risk of breathing in infectious aerosols. If office air humidity is below 40%, however, dry aerosols with crystallized salts emerge, which are smaller and lighter than wet aerosols. They stay airborne much longer, are less sticky, and therefore do not clump together so easily. Air conditioning units and office activities cause dry aerosols to be rapidly swept off surfaces back into the air, where they continue to spread. Low humidity increases the risk of infection by flu and cold viruses, not least because these viruses remain contagious for a longer period.